I think somewhere I drew the short straw, getting 2:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. But we're gonna get started with the last portion of the conference. And in order to get going, I know you were just up stretching, but I need everybody to come up and get a folder and a quote, please.
Did you just read that out loud?
Okay. Everybody have a folder? Everybody have a quote? Anybody not have one I can deliver? Okay. So my name is Kim Veith, and I've worked at Ocean Mental Health Services for the last almost 20 years. I've worked both in adolescent services and adult services. And I've worked in substance abuse, I've worked in co-occurring and in mental health. So I'm really excited, other than the fact that it's 2:30 on a Friday afternoon, to get the chance to spend some time with all of you today. I've been doing a lot of training lately, but it's been with law enforcement. So the positive is that it's not hard to look at a room full of muscular, bald men with guns. Not hard. But they're not such a warm, fuzzy crowd. They're kind of a tough group. So I feel really excited about to have the chance to work with some clinicians today and family members. And I'm sorry, you're having a hard time hearing me. Okay. So I'm really excited to have the chance today to work with a different group, some clinicians and some family members. So thank you again for coming out today. I know we have some staff from Ocean Mental Health Services. I know we have some staff from the VA and RIST. I know we have some staff from up in Monmouth County. I'm wondering, who have I missed? Is there child welfare here today?
We're from the Children's Home Society, we're contractors.
Children's Home Society, wonderful, thanks. And Ocean Medical Center, terrific. Who else do we have in the room?
Preferred behavioral.
Preferred Behavioral, awesome. Yeah. Private practice, excellent. It's always nice when private practitioners come out. I know that sometimes it feels somewhat isolated, and so you get to really network a little bit. Jersey Shore Medical Center, awesome. Okay, thank you everyone. I'm really a firm believer in interaction and the fact that you can learn things when people talk to you all day, but we each have our own unique experiences that are very important as well. And so in order for us to really grow and learn and change today, I'm hoping that we do a lot of sharing of our experience in practice, our experience in life, and that we each, get to grow and learn from our collective experience. So, Scott, my clicker isn't working. Oh, no, it's me. I got it. Sorry. Sorry, that may happen a few times today. So we're going to talk about what to expect from today, but even before we talk about what can you expect from this presentation, some of you might be sitting there saying, why pot? Why cannabis? Why are we going to talk about that today? Because kids are dying. Every single day, people are dying in this community from heroin overdoses. You're right. But what we're not always thinking about is, where did it start? How does it start? How do we get there? And the truth is, we have a whole generation of people that have been using marijuana every day for years. We have a whole new generation that's using, and a whole bunch of people in between who feel like, I don't know, maybe pot's not that big of a deal. And so I think we need to take some steps back and sort of look at what is cannabis, what is it doing in our practices, what is it doing to the people that are using it, and what can we do in response to that as clinicians and as responsible members in the community. I think that even ourselves as clinicians, we fall into that, there's this hierarchy in treatment, right? And so when you have a cannabis use disorder, you're not really you're not as worried, right? You're not worried about, are they gonna go home and overdose and die? We do that a lot with process addictions too, right? I mean, nobody's gonna die from eating a gallon of ice cream, or is it possible to have too much sex? Really, probably not, right? So those process addictions aren't gonna hurt anybody. And so we as clinicians start to have this hierarchy. They do it also in treatment, right? So when you walk in the rooms and you start to talk about having cannabis dependence, there's probably people literally who roll their eyes like, oh, this guy over here, right? My 15-year-old says that all the time, this girl over here. Like as though somehow they're ridiculous, right? I think we even do that a little bit as clinicians. But the truth is, an addict is an addict is an addict, right? And there isn't a whole lot of difference between a process addiction or substance abuse in the traditional way that we think of it. So what can you expect from our time together today? I expect you to be interactive, and from me you can expect that we're going to talk about an overview and history of cannabis, that we're going to talk about what challenges there are for you as the professional in terms of treating people with cannabis dependence. What are some of the prolonged issues related, what are some of the physical issues related to prolonged use? And then I'm going to actually give you a specific intervention developed by SAMHSA to use. It's a protocol. There are 9 total sessions. We'll quickly go through, you have in your packet actually some handouts related to it. We'll go through the protocol and go through at least the goal of each session. And you can print out the full intervention and protocol from SAMHSA. It's 200 pages. So I'm sorry, I didn't make one for each of you. I'm sure my boss is happy to hear. But it's really, really easy to download and print. But I did give you some things, because I think it's important to leave a training with some tools at least. So, I always like to put things in context, and that's why we're going to talk about history for a minute or two. I did look for a video clip or something to make it a little bit more interesting, and really all I kept coming back to was Reefer Madness. Has anybody seen that? You don't have to be afraid to admit it. Okay. I did have a good laugh here and there trying to put this together, but I did decide against using a Reefer Madness clip. So we'll just quickly put this into context. I thought it was interesting that King James, back in Jamestown, ordered all farmers to grow cannabis because they needed the hemp to make rope and it was used in trade. Cannabis originally became legal in the 19th century. Nixon era is where I guess they added more DEA agents and really started to get concerned about use of narcotics in general. The largest DEA increase came under Bush 41. Remember, that was Barbara Bush's Just Say No, her campaign. And then there always has been sort of that discourse back and forth, right? That there are some things about cannabis that are good for you. And so could it be used for medical reasons? And the first state to say, okay, yes, I think we can, was California. So more recently, 28 states have legalized marijuana for medical purposes, New Jersey being one of them. Right? I think social media makes it very confusing because, people like to, on social media, they get, muscles and they want to campaign for things, and every once in a while I see why isn't marijuana legal in New Jersey for medical purposes? These kids are, really needed. And I'm thinking, yeah, it is, but, I won't say too much. It's also interesting, Steve was just talking to those 5th and 6th grade kids at Hugh Boyd and how powerful the presentation was that day. He and I were there together, and there was absolutely no doubt it was a very, very powerful presentation, especially for those younger kids. But when we surveyed those kids, the majority of them thought that marijuana was legal. Very interesting. And he was right also in that you saw in the threads of each one of their story that there was substance abuse. And so for several of them, they were being cared for by their grandmothers who were using just about each day. And they were aware of it by, 9 or 10 years old. So marijuana is really embedded and there are a lot of beliefs about it that are both accurate and inaccurate. In 2014, I'm sure most of us remember this, Colorado and Washington became the first 2 states that legalized marijuana for recreational use. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go along today about what that impact has had on those 2 states. And in 2016, the 6 listed there followed suit. I am not aware that any of those 6 have yet set up shop where that's operational. Has anybody been to any of those 6 states where they've experienced the ability to just walk in? And I'm not asking you if you went in and bought a brownie. I just want to know if you saw it. No, okay. And it actually failed to pass in Arizona. Interestingly, I was in Arizona for an MHCA conference in late October, just the week or so before Election Day. And there was so much propaganda on TV on both sides about why it should be legalized, for the tax benefit and for many other reasons. And then, there were some other commercials on the other side. But it was interesting to see later that it actually didn't pass. So before we sort of move forward, I think it's important to understand why is pot today different than it was when you were young, or when your parents were young, or at this point when our grandparents were young, right? And what we know based on this study from the University of Mississippi is that, you can see the numbers yourself, right? I don't necessarily have to read them for you, but in 1978, the concentration of THC was 1.37%. We also know at that time that the cannabinoid, which actually is the good part of the weed, if there is one, had a higher concentration. And that by 2014, the majority of marijuana that was sampled had 12% of THC. And by 2014, the part of the chemical composition that was positive had been reduced to 0.15%. So as the negative, as the chemical that has the possible negative effect, the negative effects goes up, the positive effects come down. What is, no matter what the drug is, what is the number one thing that keeps people from getting well? I know you know. Denial. Okay, that's definitely one of them. What else? That's a good one. Because you're right, when you lie to yourself, you don't have to change anything. Right? Easy access is a good one. Connection to it, right? What keeps people from getting well, but you know what, maybe I didn't pose the question right. What is the number one thing that keeps people from getting help? Access to care, that's a huge one. And what's shame always connected to? Stigma, that's it. Thank you very much, you got it. We know this, right? As clinicians, we're always out there trying to give families tools about stigma, right? It's, how many conversations have you had where you work really hard to give parents tools to kind of stand up against the family member that's criticizing them for letting their loved one back into the house, or that's called them names, and that really need to understand why, when people are called names and when people are uncomfortable, they're not going to come forward and get treatment. The thing, though, about clinicians that all of us to remember is that we all sort of have, we're very good about telling other people what it is that they should do and how to get rid of stigma and being the experts, but we're not always really good at being inwardly focused, right? And what are our own ideas about stigma and about drug use and about treating people who use drugs and alcohol and about dealing with, you know, Dr. Guantes spoke this morning about trying to find good in behavior that you don't really care much for. How do we do that as clinicians, right? Find a way to work with someone whose behavior we're not so connected to or like so much. So I've given you each a quotation. And, you know, we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, right? I cannot cut a straight line to save my life. My mom will still say to me to this day, I really thought I was doing the right thing by not giving you scissors when you were little. But now my weakness is exposed. I'd like you to take a few minutes to look at your quote, to talk to the people at your table about your quote, what you think of it. Does it line up with your beliefs? Does it not? And I'd also just ask you to remember that being a clinician and taking that journey is always about growing, right? And our beliefs change over time. As a young clinician, I believed very much that alcoholism was genetic. My dad was Irish and my mom was Scottish, so if we took the time to try and talk about the addiction in my family, we'd take the rest of the time out. But I think part of it was defensive, but I really needed to believe that alcoholism was genetic, and so people were born that way and they just added alcohol and they had to sort of deal with the aftermath. But people who were addicted to substances did that to themselves because a narcotic is addictive in and of itself, and so they did that. And that, of course, was long before I understood brain chemistry and addiction and how people become addicted, and that all of that really, there wasn't really anything very true about that belief. But that's how we grow and learn. So talking honestly about our feelings related to addiction is part of how we grow and learn. So please take a few minutes and do that. And when we come back together, I'd like to hear a little bit about maybe some of the differences you came up with.
So I can actually be recording.
Okay, about 3 more minutes. You want to start to... Yeah. Yep, keep going. I love it. It's the first time I'm talking to each other all day.
This is where you shine.
All right, everyone. Try and bring it back in a little bit. So I'm hoping that there's someone at each table who will summarize a little bit. You know, clinicians are very relational people. So I want to hear about what your conversations were, what your quotes were. So I'm hoping that each table will give me a quick summary, or give the rest of us a quick summary. Here's the magic question. Who wants to go first? I feel like, hold on, introduce you.
We had some interesting ones. So the first one we had was drugs make me feel more normal. Carrie Fisher. I don't know if that was really the first one. I don't know about that, but it was one of them, I assure you. And you know, that one really resonated with us because of so many clients that we see. They come in and they say that the first time they used was the first time they felt normal in their own skin. And we can imagine how, you know, difficult that is for people who have to give up that drug of choice and that substance, and the reality that they'll never again feel normal or comfortable in their own skin. So we thought that was good. We talked a bit about that. I'm already so ashamed of being a junkie, now I have Hep C. I feel that if I announce that to everyone, then everyone will know that I'm a junkie. So it's a difficult stigma that goes along with it. There's so much stigma already that goes along with addiction and having, you know, a medical condition on top of that. Even, you know, we talked a little bit about people who maybe in the medical field, nurses who didn't struggle with addiction, but ended up having Hep C because of their line of work, and even just the stigma attached to that and feeling like, well, I'm a nurse, that's how it happened, you know, so I can imagine how somebody with addiction who has to report that as well, and the stigma that goes along with that. What else do we have? Oh, there's only one reason why men become addicted to drugs. They are weak men. Only strong men are cured, and they cure themselves. So that was a powerful statement right there. We talked about that. Who said that? That was Martin H. Fisher. He was a German-born American physician and author. Sir Fisher. Oh, David Lee Roth had a cute one. I used to have a drug problem, and now I make enough money. So we kind of equated that to, you know, people who come into treatment and where they're at pre-contemplation and need some motivational interviewing, that, you know, maybe they don't have a drug problem, they have a dikes problem, or they don't have a drug problem, they have a probation problem. I don't have a drug problem, I have a wife problem. So the problem isn't the addiction and the use, it's the people in their life who are telling them they can't do it anymore. So that's still a little bit. So I think that's pretty much what we have. Thanks.
Anything else? Can we talk about what they talked about? Wow. Not all at once. Okay. Thanks. All right, we'll have Jody and then the other two. Just give us a summary.
Well, one of the things that we talked about is the fact that the drugs of today, for the most part, seems to be heroin. Whereas in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, a lot of LSD was done, a lot of creativity came from them. You know, not sure whether or not the creativity of the mamas and the papas and the Beatles and so forth and so on would have been so great had they not been drug addicts. So, you know, I don't necessarily know I want to say that was us. But certainly something good came out of it. You know, what was the other one that became? The other one was, yeah, this was important, that kids, it's easier for kids to join gangs today than it is for them to be able to join football, baseball, that kind of thing, because gangs don't cost money, and football and so forth does cost a lot of money for families. And then the kids are looking for family. They don't have it at home, but they do have it in the gangs, and they also have discipline in the gangs that they don't have home sometimes. So.
Very powerful. Okay, we had a hand over here.
So one that we talked a lot about was the purpose of random testing is not to catch, punish, or expose students who use drugs, but to save their lives and discover abuse problems early so that the students can grow up and learn in a drug-free environment. And we sort of had a little back and forth about, first of all, a lot of us were in support of using random drug screens as in more of a positive light to sort of discover and help people, not so much to punish. However, in the context, it sort of sounds like this person is advocating for random drug screenings in the context of the school, which some of us had kind of an issue with, feeling like it was an invasion of privacy. So we sort of talked about the balance between the two. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All great points. And I think the thing to remember is when we, as clinicians,
Feel very strongly about something, it can be hard for us sometimes. So we absolutely need to be aware of what we feel strongly about. We need to be bringing it to supervision. But we also need to try not to feed into those hierarchies and just really think about the human being coming in the door and not necessarily what they're using. So as we talk about kind of cannabis and how it's changed over time, is there anybody here that wants to share at all about what they're seeing in their own practice in terms of what's happening? Thanks.
So I'm seeing more recently now that kids are, well, I work with kids, adolescents, are with the edibles more so than smoking. So I had a kid test positive the other day and I said, how much did you smoke? I had a cupcake. You know, so what do you write down there? Like, you know, how often, how much? 1 cupcake a day? I mean, you know, really. So for statistics, I mean, you know, and what do you tell them to decrease? I mean, eat less cupcakes? I mean, you know, how much THC is in there? All those things come into play because we were saying the THC levels are way higher in the edibles than they are in the smokable form. So, and also impacts them differently where it lasts a lot longer. So now they eat it and it might last 5 hours, whereas before it might be half hour, 45 minutes. So they don't, a lot of parents and a lot of kids don't understand the difference between the two. So I find that to be interesting.
Yeah, very interesting and very important. It's going to be a part of our conversation that we're going to lead into.
I work for the Veterans Administration, and I've been there for just about 8 years, and I'm noticing a difference in the psychiatrists and the doctors, because when I first got there, as soon as if somebody admitted that they smoked pot, it was always like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to, give you any psychotropic drugs, and it was always, they kind of had that standoffish, oh, we're going to have to, drug test you and everything like that. But over the years, it's changed. It's just gotten to the point because there's so many veterans now that now they can use medical marijuana, and it just seems like the doctors are not so opposing it, and that's a pretty short period of time for them, to change. I mean, and some of the veterans with PTSD, they say it works, so it's like, if it works, it's better than taking all the drugs that they always prescribe for their PTSD. So
what is the hand?
So I was just going to piggyback a little bit off the cupcake story. I have my college roommates who, they smoke pot. It's just, I guess that's the easiest way to say it. So when I recently went to a bachelorette party, one of them had just come back from Colorado and they brought edibles. So I'm looking at the packages just because I'm curious. And I'm like, where's the serving size information on this? And she's like, like, how do you know how much to eat of this? And apparently you're supposed to cut it in quarters and it has a certain amount of THC, but the edibles, depending, I guess, where you buy it from, don't say that. So kids are eating the entire thing. And this little thing that I'm looking at, it looked like a Rice Krispie treat. It was 8 servings. So I'm like, it's very confusing. So, I mean, it's kind of alarming, I guess it's the same thing with, using heroin. You're not really aware of how much you're using, really, what's in the bag, same thing with, smoking pot, but I just thought that was interesting to share.
So the point of edibles, which I really appreciate you bringing up, is one that helps, begs more of the question, which is how does that impact treatment? How do societal norms change? Your example, Carol, is is important in that people are changing the way that they're thinking about the drug, but the drug is changing too. And so how do we keep up with that? I guess I've thought a lot about the DSM-5 and the changes in the DSM-5, and then the fact that there is a pretty strong campaign for marijuana to be legal recreationally in New Jersey. So what does that do for us as clinicians? Right now, everybody who walks in the door that has a positive urine screen for marijuana or that admits use gets a diagnosis, right? Because it's illegal. So how does legalizing it change? You're right, unless there's a medical reason. Okay, but save that medical reason, they're going to get that diagnosis. So what do we do on, let's say the law takes effect January 1st, so December 31st, do we still diagnose them, and then January 1st not? And I guess the other thing that I've been thinking about is, and what will the standard be to help us to decide when that use changes from being recreational to problematic? Anybody have a thought or a comment about that? Right. Right.
Another question to your question.
And then that's another great point. Okay. That's a good start, I think. I think that's a great point. I don't know if everybody heard that, but what Rena was saying is that for her, some of it is around the differentiation and why they're using. Is it to manage anger? Is it as stress relief? Is it being used as a way to cope, whether it's marijuana, alcohol, any of those things? And Danielle's point was around functional impairment. Maybe we need to look at that to decide what the standard will be. Something that might also help us to sort of stick to a standard or decide will be what is the legal intoxication limit while driving? Or at least I thought that until I started to look at the research. And what Colorado has done is decided that 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC will mean that they were driving while they were impaired. So you guys do this every day, right? You do urine screens and blood tests. You've seen more colors of urine than you've ever wanted to see in your whole life, right? What's the problem with that?
It's a blood test, right?
Right. So how are you going to do that on the side of the road? What if they have a prescription for medical marijuana, but then they used more than was in their prescription? Are you going to know that by the blood test? Consent for a blood test, right? Anthony.
A big problem you run into, I think, is with alcohol, they know at like 0.08 and greater, your tolerance is impaired. Tolerance with marijuana is different per person. So the tolerance change is huge there. So how much they use per day, how often they use, whereas a person may not use a lot, they might be higher. And it stays in your system a lot longer than THC nanograms. So you have to look at that too.
All great points. That tolerance is different between alcohol and marijuana, and that there's different amounts of use will result in different amounts of THC. Heidi.
I'm wondering, I mean, I know that most police What I'm wondering is, I know when the police do blood work, they can find out how much is in their bloodstream, but the person who's driving, how do they know that they're over the legal limit? They can't do a blood test on themselves, so how do they know? With alcohol, you know how much, but with that?
You can even carry your own breathalyzer if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But how do you know?
Well, do you know how they have been dealing with it in Colorado and Washington?
So that's a great introduction to the next slide, which is that Colorado and Washington doesn't have a standard yet. That's the only standard that Colorado has. And what they're doing is training drug recognition experts and having them come out to the field and decide, okay, it looks like this person is possibly under the influence, so we're going to bring them back, we're going to try and get those consents, and we're going to build a case that they're driving while impaired. Not really working out that well. In the research, I found that AAA has said that the standard is arbitrary and really not supported by science, and that people are being wrongly convicted, in part because the 5 nanograms isn't really a good measure. AAA also found that percentage of drivers involved in a fatal accident who had been smoking doubled from 8% in 2013 to 17% in 2014. I don't know if I've been spending too much time with law enforcement, but I did feel like I needed to stick that in there, because to me, that's pretty sobering. And are we talking to our adolescents about driving after eating edibles, especially when they're not aware of what one serving of an edible is? Probably not, but after today, we sure should be. So no reason to kind of pound this anymore, other than to say that we know that they don't have a good standard to measure who's impaired, and what's happening is that people are dying on the roadways because of that. Okay, I'm going to show a clip, and then we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the clip afterward. Oh, do you need this? I just want to give a quick shout out to Scott, who's been sitting here since 8 a.m. making all this work for us. Woo!
This narcotic, unlike the opiates, the synthetics, and cocaine, is non-addictive.
What do you mean by non-addictive?
By non-addictive, it is meant that the user of marijuana, when deprived of the drug, will not experience the agonies of withdrawal. It is habituating, but its use can be discontinued.
Then what is its danger?
About 11 months sober right now. These past couple of days have been kind of hellish. I really have been wanting to smoke weed for like 2 weeks, and you think after 11 months at having stopped the substance, you wouldn't be thinking about it that much, but all of my dreams have been about it. I've actually had, well, let's see, I think 5 relapse dreams in the last 5 days, and the weird part is, like, the weed has actually been accumulating in my dreams, so it's like, I'll have weed left over in my dreams from the nights before. It makes me not want to go to sleep at night because I know that I'm just going to dream about getting high. Like, why would you want to go to sleep if you know every time you fucking go to sleep, you're just going to be thinking about the one thing that you've been trying to stop for 11 months? My name's David, and I'm a marijuana addict. I started smoking when I was 13, and by the time I got to college, I realized that marijuana had become the most important thing in my life.
Having spent the last 5 years surrounded by weed, I had adopted the mindset that it was impossible to get addicted to it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't even a drug. My problems with marijuana began when I decided it was time to stop. That's when I realized I couldn't.
Personally, do you believe that addiction is a disease or a state of mind?
State of mind.
State of
And you
mind.
cannot be addicted to marijuana.
I'd say it's a state of mind, not a disease.
The way I see it, society tends to disregard the idea of marijuana addiction. In other words, compared to harder drugs such as alcohol, heroin, or cocaine, marijuana is essentially a second-class substance, hence a second-class addiction. While most people go to extreme lengths to deny and hide their addictions, it seems like a strange paradox to me that I have to defend the idea that it's even possible to be a marijuana addict.
You guys think that people take marijuana addiction or treatment seriously for marijuana addiction?
Yeah, I didn't know there was treatment.
Never, like, people going into rehab for just marijuana or...
I don't know anyone who does that. I wouldn't.
So, I haven't been here in about 2-3 years. It's really just a shack, as you can see. I literally remember one time being like just sitting like right here and just coughing like pieces of my lungs out. I mean, literally just pieces of black stuff just coming out of my lungs, and I couldn't even.
Seems so innocent.
It's time to go to the place I went for outpatient treatment. I wanted to talk to my old counselor. I felt like maybe he could give me some insight about how after not smoking for 11 months, it was still such a fight to stay sober. I needed to know more about addiction itself. What, if anything, would you say differentiates marijuana from other addictions?
I would say one of the biggest things is maybe the denial factor. It seems so innocent, and everybody does it, so how in the world could this be a problem? And by the time some people figure that it is a problem, it's created major life issues for them.
No doubt, many of you do not believe that these things do happen, but they cannot happen to you.
Just like alcohol and other drugs, all of them have the possibility for addiction because they're mood altering. They simply make us feel better. And we have a brain, and our brain is motivated for pleasure, so anything that makes us feel good has that possibility. I mean, it could be a behavior, it could be a chemical substance, and so marijuana certainly fits that category.
You may also believe that the facts have been exaggerated.
We're getting more people coming into our treatment center who are seeking treatment for their marijuana dependency, so I do see that as a trend.
Seem to be quite a few of them. Yes, I'm afraid there are.
Heroin addiction, cocaine addiction, things like that. Some have societal approval, even though they're disapproved of. When it comes to marijuana, it seems to be a second-class addiction. It just doesn't seem to be treated as with significance the way that the other ones are. In the recovery community, lots of times you can get.
So he goes on to talk about what we talked about a little bit before, about there being a hierarchy in the recovering community around, well, it's much more impressive to be recovering from heroin addiction than it is from marijuana dependency. I'm just wondering if anybody wants to share an experience they've had around helping someone to feel legitimized in their struggle to help other people understand that marijuana dependence is real or that it happens. Anybody have any wisdom to share with us around that? Okay. So what are some of the physical implications? Have you ever treated an adolescent? How many in here have treated an adolescent? Okay, right, and how many of you have had this conversation? that's, you know, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good for you, or your brain's not developed yet, or you try all of those things, right? And they'll always come back with, yeah, but you're never gonna die from it. They're right. I don't know, if any of you have any idea about how to, you know, sort of recover from them really knowing that the fact that just plain old marijuana doesn't really necessarily have a fatal overdose. But the things that we do try to talk to them about related to physical issues is that they can be dependent on it. And their friends may not believe them. Their family members may not believe them. Sometimes we don't really even believe them, especially if there's some embedded stigma or discriminatory idea. But we know that regular cannabis users double the risk of psychosis symptoms, especially if there is family history of addiction. We know that regular use beginning in adolescence produces intellectual impairment. I do have the studies if anybody is actually really interested in reading the studies, I do have them listed at the end. We know that there's chronic bronchitis, we know that there are cardiac issues, and we know that it long-term use compromises the dopamine system. And this is smoking. So I just want to be really clear about the fact that thank you, marijuana is controlled, it's watched, it's a little bit different than just going out on the street and buying weed the way people in New Jersey do that now. Can you just...
We're talking about adults who use marijuana and what impact the drug has on their mental health and intelligence. Experts have been unable to make many definitive statements. Health authorities can only really say marijuana might do harmful things to the brain, but that more research is needed. That may be why Americans, according to a recent poll, rank sugar as more harmful than marijuana. Are they wrong? Maybe so. A new report titled Long-Term Effects of Marijuana Use on the Brain is offering fresh evidence that a chronic user's brain undergoes significant structural changes for those who've used marijuana regularly over 6 to 8 years. What kinds of changes? Using MRI scans, researchers compared the brains of 48 frequent marijuana users who took the drug on average 11 times per week to those of 62 non-users. The yellow area on this MRI scan shows the average amount that the gray matter density was diminished in the bilateral orbitofrontal cortex of the marijuana users. This is the part of the brain that's involved in decision-making. At the same time, the MRI shows the marijuana users have greater activity than the control group in another section of the brain called the forceps minor. This is the white matter that connects the brain's frontal lobes. That means, according to researchers, the pot smokers have more connections to facilitate communication between these lobes. And the more efficient communication makes it more responsive to the environment. Why do marijuana users have higher connectivity? And isn't that a good thing? Not necessarily. The report suggests this part of the brain may be compensating for gray matter losses. However, the study finds that over years of regular use, those increased connections wither away, meaning the brain may be losing its ability to compensate for lost gray matter. Then what happens?
Okay, so I just wanted to give you that brief. Yes, sure.
When they say regular use, they're saying 11 times, what did they say?
A week, 11 times a week.
Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean, because how do you know that?
Right, that's a good question. How much did they smoke that 11 times? Was it a dime bag?
Was it an hour, 2 hours, 5 minutes?
Right.
So, if you how else?
Sure.
So if you're going to say stuff to them,
Mm-hmm.
these are questions we're going to ask.
Right. So we could pull the study up at the end. These were adults that this was done on. And I think in the footnote, it gave us how much they were using, but you're 100% correct. We wouldn't, it's hard to define regular use for an adolescent, especially when they don't always have the means to buy their own, or taking from their friend, or taking from their dad's sock drawer. We're not really sure. So as I showed you earlier, there is the download on the SAMHSA website, and it is a brief treatment model. It has some motivational interviewing, which is what Dr. Guantes was talking about this morning, some cognitive behavioral therapy, and some case management. If you go to samhsa.gov, you'll find it there. You could come take a look at it after if you want. I did include in your packet, though, some of the tools that come with the assessment that we're going to just kind of go through. We all know that the assessment is the most important part in terms of getting ready to work with somebody who has cannabis dependence. The last statement I have up there, which is saying that it's client-centered, you know, there's, again, my purpose today was to sort of to get you thinking about cannabis dependence. Do you feel like it's really a problem? What will it mean when it's legal? We don't really have any good answers, but what we do know is that there will be people who present to your practices and to the VA and to the community mental health centers and to the hospitals that are going to be asking for help with marijuana dependence or cannabis dependence, and it's always good to have a tool. As part of who you are, if you don't believe in harm reduction and you only believe in abstinence, this may not be the best tool for you to put in your toolbox. But for those of you who do believe in harm reduction and you're okay with some at least sporadic use in the beginning, then this is going to be a great tool for you. So the structure is that there is an assessment. There are 2 sessions that you use for motivation, and then sessions 3 through 9 is skill building. Before you start the work, right, you always have to know, before you can start, you always have to know how to stop, right? And one of the questions that will come from your clients is about withdrawal. We know that symptoms will start within 12 to 24 hours of last use, and sometimes the symptoms will last up to 2 weeks. Flu-like, anxiety, difficulty sleeping. What you want to do is encourage them to use the things that you already have in your toolbox around guided meditation, guided imagery, relaxation, breathing, those kinds of things. Reducing caffeine, that's a huge one when you're trying to stop using cannabis. And then if symptoms persist, of course, you would refer them to their PCP or to a psychiatrist, depending on the presenting issue. So the first 2 things you have in your packet are the time follow back calendar. You're going to want to give that to them. And you know, this doesn't have to, you don't have to use that only for this particular cannabis dependence model. You can use this with your clients in just about anything. It's actually very useful. It's pretty broken down. It gives you time slots during the day where you're asking them about use, especially to your point earlier about how much, what does it look like. This is a really good tool in terms of helping you to collect that. After the time follow back calendar, you're going to want to do a good, solid, structured interview. I don't have to tell any of you how to do that. You know how to do that. That's what's going to get you to your DSM-5 diagnosis. Then you want to give them the marijuana problem scale. You have that in there. You want to give them the reasons for quitting, the self-efficacy questionnaire, and you're going to take all of those. The instructions on how to score them are in there as well. And then after your client leaves the first time, you're going to take all of that information, you're going to read it, you're going to look at it, and then you're going to put it together for them on the personal feedback form. And you'll use that form in your first session. So during the first session, I've listed the goals for you there. You want to give them back the form. You want to do some exploring, reinforcing, you want to build alliance, and you want to integrate their feedback in terms of setting goals and planning treatment. In session 2, interesting in this model, it asks you to have the client invite somebody else in, so that they have a family member, they have a loved one who's willing to come to session, and then in this packet, they give you an agreement that happens between the person they bring in and the client. Very powerful, because as they're walking through, and you know that stopping use of any substance can be very painful, and you know, people want to take a step back here and there. You have that tool, and you have that person at your disposal. So it's a very powerful tool to use. You want to redefine any goals if you need to, and you know, social support is huge. I can't stress that enough. Who do they have in their life? Somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was you, who said you had a client that was on Suboxone and everybody else in the house was using, and so that was huge for her. I can't imagine she had much social support. And we know that that's key, that they're really going to need to have that. And so you might want to take a break during that second session, or take a pause and help them to identify natural supports if they are having trouble coming up with some. Also in that packet, you're going to find the supporter agreement that I talked about. You're going to find, especially for adolescents, I find this helpful. It helps you to walk through with them how much they're actually spending on weed or whatever else. And it has a list of reasons and specific supports to stop. It helps them to identify that. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through tips about how to walk through this. You all have your own style. If you want a copy of this, I'm happy to give it to you. But basically, it's, you know, you want to make sure that you're being motivational, you're not being judgmental, all those things, you know, that we're doing anyway. In session 3, you begin to address non-substance related problems. Money, stress, mom, those kinds of things, right? And the protocol is in the book, and it will give you some suggestions. In session 4, you're going to talk to the client about coping skills, and you're going to begin to explore, you know, years ago we called it giving them their plan B, right? So when somebody's early in recovery and they're going to be in a situation where people are using, they have got to have a safe way to get out of that. So that's what you're going to use session 4. You may have to do it sooner in treatment. You'll use your best judgment. 5 is you're going to talk to them and teach them a bit about cravings and triggers. And you're going to come up with a plan around how to handle those. Session 6, automatic thoughts. So now we're getting into CBT. And they should, this is technically week like 8 or 9, they should begin to, nobody's going to be entirely clear by then, but they should be beginning to clear up a little bit. In session 7, you're going to teach them how to solve, right? You've sort of been helping them solve problems the whole time. Now they need the skills to be able to solve their own problems, and apply that to use of marijuana. Also going to begin to talk about termination, but when do we really talk about termination? We have to teach them how to say no. In session 9, unexpected triggers, again, that plan B. Could just go back to that plan B for them. And then, you know, there are lots of different schools of thought, which we could probably spend a half an hour on, right, about relapse. And is relapse a part of treatment? Is it not, right? Some clinicians will say, well, relapse is a part of treatment, and that's okay. And other clinicians will say, no, it's not. It doesn't ever have to happen. For whatever school that you belong to, we should at least prepare our clients for the possibility of relapse and what they should do in the aftermath of that. especially for somebody who's motivated and really working hard, it may come out of left field for them and can be devastating. I'm sure you all know that. So there are 9 sessions, and you'll also, in that last session, want to give them a plan for continuation if they need to continue, or a plan for step down, or a plan for what's next. Like I said, it's online, it's really easy to get. How about questions? I know I went through that pretty quickly, but it's almost 4 o'clock on a Friday, and a lot of it is kind of printed out for you. Sure.
So let's say you're going through it and the relapse happens only 3 or 4 weeks into it. So let's say you're going through the weeks, you're following the progress, and only 3 or 4 weeks into it, relapse happens. Are you back to square one, or you just keep going forward?
So that's a great question. Everybody's different. I would use your own best judgment. It depends on how long the relapse was. Like if they didn't come to see you for a couple of weeks, then I would definitely go back to the beginning and start again. But if they came right back, I might just take a couple steps back, review skills, and then move ahead. Anybody else? How close is it to 4 o'clock? 20 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes isn't bad. So somebody really can ask a question without getting like the look of death if they wanted to from the other table. Right? Anybody else? Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend.